Hi there, it's Louis from Blue Gypsy Homestead. Today we're going to cover a subject that you may have heard of before but don't know a lot about. It's called stratification. And so in this video, what I'm going to do is explain very quickly what stratification is. And I'm going to give you an example of something that I've been doing that seems to be working well for cold. Welcome back to Blue Gypsy Homestead. So if this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. So today, let's talk about cold stratification and some of the experiments I've been doing. First of all, I'll start with explaining what cold stratification is. Essentially, what you're doing is you're mimicking what would naturally happen in the winter to a seed that was basically went through the winter. And when spring comes along, it effectively defrosts. And that is a signal to the seed to wake up and start growing. So the technical term is many tree seeds have an embryonic dormancy phase and generally will not sprout until this dormancy cycle is broken. So that's what you're doing. Basically, you're going to effectively force the seed, trick the seed into thinking that it's gone through winter and now it's time to wake up. By the way, stratification is different from scarification. Scarification is basically where you somehow, I'll say, damage the outside shell of a hard seed so that the water moisture can penetrate easier. This is a common thing with tree seeds in general because the tree seeds have a very tough outside shell, and that's why tree seeds sometimes will take up to 2 years to start growing after they've been in the ground. So that's that. So cold stratification is the process of subjecting seeds to both cold and moist conditions. And you would typically do this for a minimum of 3 months-ish. Seed dormancy is a survival trait that provides the seeds from initiating germination under conditions that would lead to low probability of survival. In other words, if the seeds are not going to have a good chance of survival, the dormancy is what basically keeps them asleep until the conditions are just right. Because otherwise, they might go. You've seen this when you have trees that go into bloom, blossom, and in the spring, and then there's a late frost, and it kills all the blossoms, and then, of course, you get no fruit. Same basic idea. The dormancy protects the seed, well, rather the seedling, from coming out too early and possibly being killed off by frost. So in the wild, dormancy is overcome by spending the winter in the ground, buried under. Typically in the forest, it'd be buried under piles of leaves, for example. So the seed would fall to the ground before the leaves, and then the leaves would fall to the ground, covering the seed, giving it a blanket. Then, of course, on top of the leaves, you would get the snow. So you have your moisture, and those are the conditions that the seed needs to have to go into dormancy. So the cold stratification would ideally be between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius or 34 to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The moist environment for at least 1 to 3 months if you're going to do this, if you're going to force the seeds. In nature, it's probably going to be 3 to 4 months. You put the seeds in some kind of a mixture, typically vermiculite, peat moss, or sand, and refrigerate it in a plastic bag or some other sealed container. Personally, I like to use takeout containers. It's just it keeps everything nice and clean. In other cases, stratification involves drilling holes in a bucket, layering sand and seeds in the bucket so that you have 1 layer sand, 1 layer seeds, 1 layer sand, 1 layer seeds. And there are holes in the bucket, so this allows the moisture to get into the bucket. And also, it doesn't allow the seeds to rot because the moisture isn't trapped inside. And then you take that bucket and you bury it in the ground, typically with about a foot of soil above it. So what happens is you've effectively created not a greenhouse, in fact, quite the opposite. You've created a situation where the seeds have the opportunity to go through their dormancy phase. Now, you're not pressing them, you're not pushing them at this point. This is actually a normal dormancy, but you're just facilitating it. You're just controlling it. So it'll go through the winter, and then when winter's gone and spring is there, you dig up the bucket, you empty out the bucket carefully, and you'll notice that many times, the seeds have already started to sprout. I've seen this with chestnuts, for example. So I'm going to be trying this. With black walnuts, for example. Again, same sort of idea. You're not, in that case, you're not pushing it. You're actually you're mimicking nature. So one of the things I've noticed is that when ambrosia apples, they happen to be my favorites. It's very strange. If I take, as an experiment, I took some ambrosia apples, I put them in the freezer, and I left them there for about a month, and they froze solid. And then what I did was I took them out of the freezer and I planted them. So what happened was at that point, and this was in the spring. I would plant them in the spring, the frozen apples. And what I noticed was that 1 month in the freezer and immediate planting of the whole apple actually started to grow. So I would see apple seedlings, if you will, come up. Now, what is kind of strange is because with the ambrosia apple, I noticed this completely by accident. And I know I'm focusing on the ambrosia apple, and it's quite possible this happens with other apples as well. But I noticed that more often than not, the seeds at the core of the ambrosia apple would start to sprout all by themselves. Even if they were left on the counter, they didn't have to be frozen. And my theory is how the apples are actually stored for transport. I assume that based on all the things that go with dormancy, I'm assuming that the apples are subjected to a cold, damp environment to keep them longer, them ripen, because I'm sure they don't come off the tree ripe. And so, and that actually accidentally kickstarts the seeds in that apple. Why is it only the ambrosia apple? I don't know. I haven't seen it in any other apple. I don't think it's the only one that does it, but it's the only one I've ever seen do it. I've tried a couple of different ones, Red Delicious, Empires. I've even tried Spartans. Nothing. I've seen nothing of it. It's so far it's unique to the ambrosia as far as I'm concerned, but I have no explanation. So, and what's really interesting is it's not unusual to get 3 to 6 germinated seeds in a single apple. So now, once, as you see, I've pulled out all those seeds and I've planted them in the temporary pots. I uppot them when they get to a certain level, and then I take them outside so that they can be hardened off. Hardened off, of course, means that they get used to being in the sun. Now, they'll stay out all summer. However, when they lose their leaves in the fall, they come in because they are not ready to overwinter. They won't be ready to overwinter really for about a year. So when it is time to plant them in the following spring, I'll use my post digger, deep hole, probably about a foot. I backfill it with soil and compost, and I water it heavily. Then I'll place the tree inside, bury the tree and its roots. I might mulch around the tree, but I always mulch so that the water would run away from the trunk, not towards it. And that's to make sure that it doesn't drown the tree and doesn't rot the trunk. Effectively, that's not where the tree will pick up its water, will pick up any kind of moisture. It won't pick up its nutrients. It picks up its nutrients, actually, at the outer edge of the canopy. In other words, where the furthest reach of the branches is. That's where that's where the tree will pick up the most of its nutrients. So if you're going to fertilize, that's what you want to do. You want to notice where the longest branches are. Draw an imaginary circle around the tree. That's where you're going to fertilize. Just to keep that in mind. Also, what I'll do, and I do this all the time now, is that I will take red clover, and I'll seed the red clover around the trunk of the tree. This helps keep down the weeds. It also, as the clover dies off, it becomes a green fertilizer. And so it's nice as a weed suppressant, and it works really well, especially if you seed it heavily. It doesn't take anything away from the tree. In fact, it fixes nitrogen in the soil. So that's something else. And the nitrogen, if it's in and around the base of the tree, honestly, it's not going to do the tree very much good, but it will certainly help some of the microbes in the soil, which is going to help your tree in the long run. Some of the extra protection that I might use is some French drain pipe. I'll take a piece that's about 30 centimeters, 12 inches long. I'll cut it up the side so that it's, actually, I might not even cut it up the side. The key is to get this pipe around the base of the tree so that it keeps the mice, voles, and any other ground-based critters away from the tree trunk. Another thing you can do, of course, is going back to the whole wood ash. You can sprinkle wood ash around the edge of that pipe, and that will keep a lot of the bugs that you don't want in the way, away from the tree. So now, again, these trees are not ready to overwinter right away. So all of this that I just described will only happen in year 2. Typically, what you'll notice is that the spring of year 2, the trees will be somewhere between 2 to 3 feet or 60 centimeters-ish. And that's going to be the perfect size to put it outside. Again, you're going to still want to, you're still going to want to do some kind of getting the plant used to being outside again, because it would have been inside all year, all winter. So you want it to get used. Once it starts greening up outside, then you know it's all right. However, this is kind of a tough part. You can do that, and depending on how many trees you have, you can do that by planting the tree first and covering it with, wrapping it with some kind of translucent material. I don't know, some kind of a plastic. And that'll give the opportunity for the sunlight to get in but not burn the trees. However, it also gives the tree a chance to establish its roots, which is really important. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you fertilize the tree around the edge of the tree where the furthest part of the branches go. Don't over-fertilize. Don't over-fertilize. Be sure that you follow the directions. More is not better. Follow the directions. Make sure you buy the fertilizer that you need for fruit trees, because what's good for one type of plant is not necessarily good for another. You definitely want fruit tree fertilizer. That's a given. The reason for that is because the chemical composition, or the element composition, of fruit tree fertilizer is different than vegetable fertilizer. It might be just a little bit different, but it might have more potassium. It might have more nitrogen. It might have. The truth is, somebody else has done that work already. So don't try and figure it out again. It's already done. Go with it. So keep in mind that those trees that you've planted now, they're 1 year old, and they probably will not bear fruit for another 2 to 3 years. They might, and if they do, it'll be 1 or 2 apples. Nothing great in terms of numbers. However, don't be discouraged. This is normal. The other thing is, of course, if you're ever worried when you get into spring and you're ever worried that somehow you don't think the tree is doing well, you can take your fingernail and just lightly scratch the bark of the tree. And if where you scratched is green, that tells you essentially that the tree is alive. Because if it wasn't, it would be brown. Also, you can try bending some of the branches. And if the branches bend easily, and I'm not saying bend them all the way over, but just bend them slightly. And if they don't break under slight pressure, those branches are still alive. So give it some time. Sometimes some trees take a little bit longer to leaf out than others. So just keep that in mind. Give them the opportunity to follow their natural course. Keep the trees watered well in the first year. You should really water your trees regularly, but in the first year, as the roots are being established, it's especially important that you have plenty of water at the roots, at the tips of the roots, and don't overdo it. You can drown a tree. I've done it. Not on purpose. What happened was that I planted trees in what turned out to be the wettest summer that we'd ever seen here. And the soil that I planted in was a mix of sandy loam and clay. And so as a result, the water had nowhere to go. Okay, in this scene, basically what we're doing is we're taking the apple cores that were the result of essentially taking them through a peeler, which allows these cores to be popped out. The apples were used for a recipe, so I figured I'd take these cores and use these instead. Now, as you can see, I break it open, and I'm looking for seeds that have begun to sprout, much like the ones on the right-hand side. I take my knife and I carefully cut down the core so that I can expose the seeds without breaking the sprouts. Now, I'm usually successful at this, not always. However, they are very delicate, and you have to be very careful when you're pulling them out. You can see me working with this to tease them out with my fingers. Sometimes I'll use a set of tweezers. But the problem with the tweezers is that it's easy enough to squeeze too hard and actually crush the sprouts. So that's why you also have to be careful, of course, with the knife, but that's why I tend to tease them apart with my fingers. It ends up being, it's more work, but in the end, you get a better result. I'm able to pull out significantly more sprouted seeds this way. So if I run into a situation like this one, where two sprouts from two different seeds are entangled, then it's a little bit more difficult, a little more delicate, but you take them out together. Don't try and separate them in the core. Now you'll notice that not every seed has sprouted, and that's okay. You'll also notice that there are significantly more seeds sprouted than not. So again, it's one of those very strange situations, and I've only seen this with the Ambrosia apples, where without any extra work, so without the stratification, the seeds actually begin to sprout in the apple itself. Now, I have a theory about this, and it has to do with how the apples are actually transported and then stored once they're at either the warehouse or the grocery store itself. And I'm quite certain it's because of the fact that these apples are likely stored at a lower temperature to make them last longer. So again, roughly 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's Fahrenheit, double it, add about 34 degrees Fahrenheit works out to about 2 degrees Celsius. Anyway, so what I've been noticing is that the Ambrosia apples exclusively, again, I have no explanation for this, are the ones that give me the most successful sprouted seeds of any other apple. And I've tried several. I'll buy several different types of apples just because I want to change it up. The Ambrosia apple happens to be my favorite, so for me it's easy. But again, it comes down to an odd situation. Now, essentially what happens here is that for whatever reason, one that I can't explain, the Ambrosia apple seems to be subjected to stratification, or a mimicking of stratification, such that the seeds begin to sprout in the apple. And the thing about it is that these sprouted seeds actually have a pretty high success rate when it comes to planting them. You'll see me just planting them afterwards, and I'll throw in some still photos of some of the seeds that I've already planted. But the Ambrosia apples have a very high success rate in terms of going further, sprouting further, and actually growing into seeds, trees. Now, you notice just before I teased that apart with the tip of the knife, again, you have to be very careful, because if you try and do this with your fingers, or tease them apart with your fingers, it is highly likely that you're going to break the sprouts. And once you break the sprouts, you may as well compost the seed, because it will not create another sprout. It only has one. So you have to be careful. In my case, I have a lot of these apples, so it's not a problem. It's not a problem if I lose one or two seeds. And, you'll see that I actually have, there are some seeds that just don't sprout. And in that case, they get it. But here's the last of the ones I'm going to pull out and set them aside. So there you go. Right now we have, 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 seeds. Seeds ready to go. These seeds will be plants that I'm going to get. I move on to the stage where I'm going to plant them. So I'll take these small trays, they've been pre-filled with soil, and I will individually pick up each seed and place it inside one of the holes. I'm using a dibbler, of course, to make the holes. I use my fingers for this, unless it's so small that I can't use it. Then I'll take a pair of tweezers. But again, you have to be careful with the tweezers, because if it's off just a little bit, you will break the sprout, which is a shame considering all the work you put into extracting the seeds in the first place. So you want to be careful. So as you can see, I'm just basically placing each seed on top of the soil, on top of the hole in the soil, rather. And I'll continue to do this until I run out of space. The key here is to get these seeds into soil as quickly as possible, because if you don't, they will dry out. Sometimes what I have to do, as you'll see in a second, is that I have to actually double up in one of the sections. I'll actually double it up. This is not crucial, not critical. Again, the seed has to go into soil. What I'll do afterwards is, since this is temporary, I will then separate out, not thin, I will separate the trees out once they've sprouted into something that's at least 2 or 3 inches tall, 5 to 10 centimeters tall. I'll separate them out and I will repot them, whatever, into at least 4-inch pots. And as I go along, I cover up the seeds, and they then will be, the moisture in the soil that I've already put in these things is enough to preserve the seed long enough for me to get it placed into a tray that's already watering from the bottom. That's the key. You can water from the top, and that's great. But honestly, watering these from the bottom, I find, has worked better than watering from the top. So once the trees have reached about 15 centimeters tall, so roughly 6 inches, you take the whole tree and its pot, remember it's up potted to 4-inch pots, and you move them outside for the late spring, summer, and early fall. You want them to get used to being outside. However, they are not strong enough to overwinter yet, so they can't be left outside. They will not survive. So what you have to make sure that once the leaves fall from it, because it will leaf out. Sorry, they will leaf out. But you've got to make sure that once it throws its leaves, or maybe even before then, I would wait, you bring them inside. Certainly bring them in before the first frost. They could probably handle the first frost because it'll be light, but still, you don't want to take any chances. You've put a lot of effort and a lot of time into these things. So you bring them inside, and you put them in a place where they can go dormant. Trees go dormant this time. And that just means that they will not do anything. They'll just sit there quietly like they would outside, except that it's going to be warmer. Well, not too warm. You want to keep it in a cool, dry, dampish kind of place. You still have to water them, but very little. Very, very little. Maybe once a week at the most. And at that point, we're talking about, I don't know, maybe a quarter cup of water at the very most once a week, just to keep the soil damp. If you want to put down some peat moss on top of it to keep the soil, keep the moisture in the soil, that's a good idea too. But don't go crazy. You don't want these plants to sit in water. So anyways, fast forward to the following spring. Once spring comes along, you want to, well, I'll tell you what I do. Basically what I do is I'll take my post digger, it's about a 4-inch post digger, and I'll drill holes for the trees where they're going to go. And then what I do is I'll backfill those holes with soil and compost, pretty much to the top. I don't go very deep. I might dig down, I don't know, a foot, 30 centimeters, at the very, very most. And what that does is it gives the roots somewhere to go very quickly, easy soil to break through. Because if you're like me and you've got sandy loam is actually not bad, but if you've got clay is very difficult for the tree to get through. Not impossible, just difficult. And you want to make life as easy as possible for these trees. So once you've got the hole dug and backfilled, you place the tree in it and you cover it. You cover the roots, of course. And then one of the things I'll do is, well, there's 2 choices. You can actually mulch the base of the tree. But if you are going to mulch the tree, it's very important that mulch a tree, or any plant for that matter, so that the water runs away from the trunk, not towards it. Because the tree won't absorb water at the trunk. It absorbs water at the end of its roots. And the end of its roots are where the canopy ends. Now, the canopy is a fancy word for saying the furthest reach of the branches. So if your tree is, 4 feet across through the the widest point, that is the extent of the canopy. So that's where it's going to pick up most of its nutrients. So that's also the place you're going to fertilize. If you're going to fertilize, that's where you fertilize. I find that if you can do one of two things again. You can either put down some woven weed fabric to make sure that the weeds don't choke out your tree. That's one of my favorites. The second thing I do, or rather what I choose to do instead, is that I seed heavily with red clover. Now, seeding heavily with red clover does two things. First of all, it does help hold the weeds down. Second of all, it attracts bees. So if your tree is in bloom, then the tree is attractive enough on its own, but let's face it, the red clover is certainly going to help. But when it dies back in the winter, it will provide a green fertilizer. Also, red clover is known to be a nitrogen fixer. So that means that essentially you're going to have nitrogen powerhouse right there at the base of your tree. Again, you want to spread it around so you're going to get to the canopy. Now, red clover is self-seeding, so you don't have to do it more than once, and it's cheap. It's very inexpensive. I seeded it. I think it's something like $3 for half an acre to cover half an acre. I double seed it, so again at that price I can afford to. But the lushness at the base of your tree is just fantastic. There is one other thing I'll do, and I will take a piece of French drain pipe, maybe 30 centimeters, a foot long, and I'll put it over the tree while it's still small, and that will work to protect the base of the tree from animals such as rabbits and mice and other rodents from eating the bark on the tree. You definitely want to try and do that. It gives you a little bit more peace of mind. And if you want to go one step further, you can sprinkle some wood ash around the very, very base, around that pipe, so that it'll keep back things like the slugs and the snails. You can learn more about how wood ash works to help your plants in the video that deals with wood ash. I can put a link to that in the description. So in the beginning, we made a lot of mistakes. We didn't know any better. We were planting for the first time. We were planting trees for the first time. Well, yes and no. I planted trees on many occasions, but never on the scale that we planted on the first time. And so we spent a lot of money on it. We bought, I believe, 100 trees to begin. And we went out into the field and began to plant these trees. We did it by shovel, and it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work. We worked hours and hours to plant those 50. And because the ground was a mix of sandy loam and clay, it didn't drain at all, and there was a lot of standing water. So that's about it as far as that experiment goes. Again, you can go back and reference the pictures that I've put in to see how those seeds have progressed. Now, of course, what you're seeing there are seeds that I started several weeks ago. You'll see the gradual growth that you can expect from seeds like that. Now, again, that worked for me with the Ambrosia apples. Will it work for you with Ambrosia? Will it work with other apples? I don't know. It depends where you are. It depends where you get your apples. It depends what time of year. I would find that early in the season, as the apples are coming off the tree, it isn't something I'm finding very often. It's really something I'm finding during the winter, during the off season, if you will, for the apple. Failing that, try an experiment with other apples. Try freezing them, defrosting them, and then letting them warm up and see what happens. Will they rot? Yes, they will rot, but that's inconsequential if your ultimate goal is to get the seeds. You could also just keep the apples in the fridge and see what happens. Keep it in the coldest part of your fridge, which is usually the bottom, and see what happens. Anyways, with that, I wanted to wish you a great day. Thank you for stopping in. Be sure to check out the other, some of the other videos that we have online. There's a number of them to choose from, and some of them are shorts, like 2 to 5 minutes, and others are a little bit more convoluted, ones like I do. So, in any case, thanks for stopping in. I really do appreciate it. share with your friends, hit that like button, subscribe by all means, because you're going to help us grow the channel, which is my ultimate goal. Again, thank you. I'm Louis from Blue Gypsy Homestead, and I appreciate you stopping in. All the best. Bye-bye.